What distinguishes a totalitarian society from an open one? A number of aspects, I'm sure, but one: watching, surveillance, being afraid to talk into the telephone because it's being tapped, being afraid to talk among friends because perhaps somebody is listening, being afraid certainly to perhaps even talk in a restaurant because someone might have a tape recorder nearby. This sounds goofy, and yet this is one of the aspects of our society right now that is creeping in on us. Sandberg said, little cat feet. It's after Watergate, and you would think, would you not, that now, with the expose of CIA's venality and what it's been doing here as well as abroad, that there'll be more of an open society, and yet we know more and more it's being institutionalized. There's a committee in Washington called the Center for National Security Studies that's dedicated to the idea of watching the watchers. And a member of that group is Robert Borosage, whose book forthcoming with John Marks is called CIA File. Remember, John Marks collaborated with the former CIA employee, our friend, Victor Marchetti. Remember the book that was censored in advance? The publishers allowed the CIA to censor it in advance. And another member of the group is Mr. Halperin, Mort Halperin, who worked for Kissinger and was tapped by Kissinger. And with Robert Borosage is Dick Criley of Chicago, who's the director of the Alliance to End Repression that instituted the...
I'm not director. I'm one of the founders of it. I'm a member of the steering committee, and I'm director of the Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, and this is the group that helped institute the suit against the watching locally here.
We did institute the suit against the Red Squad.
Against the Red Squad, Mayor Daley, and Attorney General Levy.
No, Levy was thrown in later. Our suit was local.
Okay, so...
And the Mayor Daley tried to get out, but the court ruled that he's in it.
So this program in just a moment, the program with Robert Borosage and Dick Criley on the subject of watching the watchers for the sake of our own freedom, I suppose, to talk, to think, and to be free in talking and thinking. Program in just a moment. The conversation with Robert Borosage and Richard Criley. The Center for National Security Studies does what?
Well, basically, we started a year ago on the theory that national security had become a sort of incantation used to justify abuses of executive power and to justify an authoritarian power in the presidency without the legislature or anybody else having any say over it. So what we do is study institutions that are justified by the phrase national security, study their activities, and try to present them to the people and to publicly, and get into a public debate about whether or not we ought to be carrying on these activities, whether or not they have anything to do with the defense of the country, and whether or not they ought to be secret.
One of the questions people would ask is, shouldn't we sort of relax now and take it easy, since Watergate and CIA, seemingly on the defensive, will keep us open for Bob and Dick?
Well, I think, in a sense, it's the reverse. The worst thing about when events are secret, then we're all naive, and people who are doing things that they think are questionable or illegal are on their guard, because at any time they might become public, and so they're a little more reluctant to engage in truly bad acts. But when they're exposed, we lose our innocence, and if they're exposed and they don't get stopped, if they're exposed and legitimated, or if they're exposed and there's no public outrage, then the raps are off. They're legitimate, you can do them, they've been approved in a sense by the public by their lack of reaction. So what we see in terms of all the revelations about the CIA, for instance, is that the Rockefeller Commission report essentially legitimates most of them. And the recommendations of the Rockefeller report would make them all legal. And if people don't react to that, then the raps will be off the CIA both at home and abroad, and it'll be worse than it was before.
President Ford has practically given up the code of honor. Keep going. A few aberrations here and there, but let's go. Keep going.
You know, we have a little bit of a local parallel. The Daily News, the Sun-Times, the Tribune have run headline story after headline story about the Red Squad. And we found out some interesting things, that the president of one of the important community groups in Chicago, the Organization for Better Austin, was a Red Squad operative. And the organization almost fell apart during his presidency. We know that the Red Squad was in liaison with a terrorist group the Legion of Justice, who were programmed to...
This group actually did
they
raid
burglarized,
places.
they raided
burglarized.
places, they threw stink bombs into theaters.
This is the late Tom Sutton's group.
Right,
Yeah.
right. All this stuff has become public. And in effect, the police superintendent and Daley have said, so what? You know, we need to do surveillance because how do we know that some group might not secretly call a demonstration and create a traffic jam? Or they might want to shoot the president. And therefore, we've got to conduct this kind of surveillance. And so we do face this danger that now these incredible things that are totally non-law enforcement have become public. And if the public does not respond, it's almost worse than when no one knew they were doing it, and therefore they were careful not to get exposed.
Isn't this one of the horrors, Bob? Like, people can adjust, as they did in Germany to some extent. People can adjust to repression, one way or another, rationalize it. As a result, something happens to us.
Oh, exactly. For instance, people are now accustomed to being on camera in every store they walk into, right, for shoplifting. Well, if you start having people accustomed...
Entering a building, too,
right,
by the way. Entering any building.
building.
The building you
The
just
airport.
entered. By the way, you were on candid camera when you came in this building.
That's right, we had to sign in, too. and so it's... Now everyone's kind of accustomed to a surveillance that was unheard of in this country 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Well, the same thing will start happening with telephone conversations, right? If everyone assumes that telephone conversations are wiretapped, then they adjust to it and they don't carry on the kinds of conversation they might otherwise, but they also don't attack the notion of having their telephone conversations wiretapped. If political dissent is seen as suspect, one of the things, of course, that happens is that it gets chilled. People don't go out on the street and they don't meet with their colleagues to discuss political problems because they assume there's a police agent there. And so people stay home and watch television.
What happens then to conversation? What happens to thought? And there's also less and less... I imagine what happened will be less and less full of thoughts. More and more the spectator and more silent. So it won't be the silent majority as the silent, unanimously silent.
You know, there's a real problem of deciding what's important to do and then kind of keeping a focus on that. We've had we've had police agents, 3 of them as a matter of fact, who were assigned to the Alliance to End Repression. One danger is that you become paranoid, so you don't dare talk.
Right.
You assume everywhere there's a police agent, so you don't get any business done. You go on a spy hunt. You suspect the wrong people.
In fact, that's the theory of the FBI. Hoover had a memo in the FBI saying we want everyone to think there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox, right, so that they get scared.
See, then on the other hand, you can't look at it and say, well, they didn't actually stop our operation, therefore I couldn't care less, because they can ultimately endanger the freedom of people to operate. So there's a question of keeping your bearing, of not getting paranoid, and at the same time recognizing that a tremendous gut issue in America is this question of our maintaining the kind of freedom that gives us an opportunity to deal with the problems in our society.
Well, I was thinking, I thought you were about to say something. I know you're about to say many things. This matter of paranoia, then, we become less, of course, we become less human, we become less thoughtful, but we also can suspect an acquaintance, perhaps even a friend. This becomes the horror. If you belong to an organization, say, to better a community, something that is anti what Richard Daley represents, let's say, or what Gerald Ford or his predecessor might have represented. And if you're with that group, then, hey, wait a minute, if the FBI's premise is right, make people suspect each other, then things could happen in our personal lives too, can it not?
Right. I mean, I think that's why the worst thing is to react to paranoia. I think the first step is to decide what you're going to work on and continue to work, and work in an open and trusting way, and then make sure that that officials understand that that people are not going to put up with the kind of surveillance and the kind of informing and the kind of infiltration that's going on now.
I suppose we should discuss this part first, what appears to be the apathy on the part. Dick was talking about the 3 papers and their exposés, and they've been quite sensational. I mean, literally sensational. And yet there hasn't been too much of an outcry here locally, has there?
Well, a number of organizations were very angry. And groups came down 100 strong before the police board to raise all kinds of hell about the fact that they had these informers placed in their organizations. But the trouble is we seem to cool off too soon. And if we're going to do anything serious, 1 week or 1 month of anger isn't enough. You have to hang in there and pursue the issues. And I think this is our problem, to create the structures so that we have the staying power to deal with the problem.
There's another problem, and that's one of fear. When people hear about the CIA, they think about, well, we need them to defend our country.
National security.
Right. When they hear about the FBI, they think, well, we need them against criminals and crooks. And people are frightened, legitimately so, of crime at home, and they're frightened about the defense of the country. And so they justify the activities of these agencies. And the important thing to understand is that what we've got is both the CIA abroad and the FBI at home spending most of their resources on activities that don't have anything to do with crime or with defense. The FBI spent an immense amount of resources infiltrating, sabotaging, wiretapping, and etc. the Socialist Workers' Party for 26 years, and they never found one incident of a criminal act. Not one. And people say, well, they're Socialist Workers' Party, aren't they socialists or Marxists, and doesn't that mean they're illegal? But they're not. They were a legitimate, totally free political party that never committed a criminal act, and the FBI spent 26 years trying to destroy them.
But what could apply to them, the Socialist Workers' Party, can equally, indeed has applied, say, to the Better Government Association.
Exactly.
Right.
To the Independent Voters of Illinois. Isn't that a more, quote-unquote, respectable group?
Now, because the issue is really not whether somebody is studying Karl Marx, it's whether or not they're dissenters. And the pattern of the local spying here was directed inevitably to groups that were critical of the Daily Machine, and not directed to crime. One of the major infiltrators, paid as full-time policeman for 5 years in the Alliance, admitted that he was mainly assigned to see whether or not we were really going to bring about a suit against the Red Squad. That was his assignment. They asked him, did you say anything illegal? And he said, yeah, I saw the director park his car illegally once.
Before I ask about Senate Bill number 1, Bob Borosage and Dick Crowley used the word Red Squad. Original title of that was the Industrial Squad. A little history might be in order here. That was formed by secret police of Chicago, police who were seeking to break the CIO in its early days.
You know, then it became the anti-subversive detail. Then it became, most recently, more sophisticated as the security section of the intelligence division of the police department.
Because euphemisms used all the time, aren't they? Euphemisms. National security itself was a euphemism.
Exactly. Executive action is the CIA word for assassination, for murder. Preventive action is the FBI word for breaking and entering into citizens' homes. That kind of thing is a constant in those agencies, partly to justify their own activities to themselves.
So as committee hearings are being held, the church committee is holding hearings, and I'll ask you how your thoughts are about what is being accomplished and what perhaps is not being accomplished. Something else is before the Senate right now. It's called, just the title, S1, Senate Bill 1. What does that mean to us?
This S1 is a total revision of the criminal code, a revision, incidentally, that's long overdue. It's sponsored by two senators, Hruska and McClellan, and the problem with the bill is not that it's a total revision of the criminal code, but that it's probably the most pernicious piece of legislation that's been introduced in the Senate in the last 25 years. It is almost as if someone went through the crimes of Watergate and decided to pass a law that would make all those activities legal. You have John Ehrlichman said that the break-in at Watergate and at Fielding's apartment was legal because it was ordered by the president.
Just for those who may not know, Fielding was the psychiatrist of Ellsberg during the break-in.
He said it was legal because it was ordered by the president and in the national security. S1 says that if you receive an order from a superior, then that's a defense to a criminal offense, and that you go free if you had a superior's order. The other classic, of course, is the official secrets part. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I should mention, by the way, that this character is not so accidental given the authorship of the bill, because in fact these main provisions of the bill were drawn up by, under the supervision at least, of John Mitchell, Richard Kleindienst, and Robert Mardian during the Nixon administration, just before the Watergate cover-up came apart. so that if you made a checklist of the particular concerns of the Nixon administration, where the people frustrated what they were doing, what they would need to guarantee that every Daniel Ellsberg was behind bars, and then you wrote a law to accomplish this. This is the general nature of Senate 1.
Now, would there have been an expose of Pentagon Papers if there were an S-1 in effect?
There might have been an expose, but Ellsberg would have gone to jail. What S-1 does is it enacts for the first time in American history it would enact an Official Secrets Act. And an Official Secrets Act says anything that any government official stamps secret with a stamp is irremediably secret, and no one can reveal it. Anyone who publishes it or anyone who leaks it to the press or to the public can be criminally prosecuted and put behind bars.
Now, who decides what are official secrets? What is called classified information?
Well, this is what the executive branch does. And I think it's important to see this secrecy thing historically, because people are thrown off their guard with the national security arguments. They see a title of a law, espionage, and they think this has to do with foreign agents altogether. Well, the fact is that government secrecy and the classification of documents was really a wartime thing that became a major instrument of government in World War I, to make sure that the enemy didn't know that troop transport was going to leave so it would be caught by the submarine pack, this kind of thing. But since World War II, as we have had this strange accretion of institutions of secret government, no one knows anything about even how much they are funded, then this security blanket has taken on a totally different meaning. And now I think where we are at the crunch is whether or not our democratic society is going to succeed in opening up this other government that can make national policy, commit us to wars, assassinate presidents abroad and maybe our own presidents, intervene in a total sense to make the decisions that are supposed to be made in a democratic way without the public even knowing what is being done, and therefore totally lacking power to cope with this decision-making process. Senate 1 would institutionalize this. Would do a lot of other things, by the way. It would also institutionalize the fact you don't have a right to assemble, you don't have a right to protest, and many, many other aspects go down the drain. But right now, I think with reference to what Bob is talking about and the secret institutions, the fundamental problem is whether or not people in a democratic society are going to have the right to know what the actual government is doing, and whether that knowledge becomes the basis for criminal penalties up to, conceivably, including a death penalty, as is the case in the espionage law as now drafted in Senate 1.
The First Amendment of the Constitution was drafted to ensure that there'd be a free marketplace of ideas, an exchange of ideas on all sorts of views. And in this country, we have a free marketplace of ideas, but increasingly what we don't have is facts, because the facts are censored right at the source, and that is, facts about what our government's doing are censored by the classification stamp. So while you and I might be for or against this or that thing that our government's doing, we may not know about half of it because we don't have any facts. So the public discussion in this country is impoverished on major facets of our government's policy because there is no factual information that's open to public discussion. That's censorship at the source, prior restraint, if you will, and has been seen by the Supreme Court for years as the worst thing you could do under the First Amendment. S1 it would now make that official. The interesting thing about S1 is that virtually anyone you talk to in Washington will agree that there is 90% of the information that is classified should not be and need not be. Doesn't have anything to do with national defense, doesn't have anything to do with secret armaments or things we don't want the enemy to hear. A lot of it's classified by routine, some of it's classified to cover up bureaucratic crime, some of it's classified simply because there are people paid to classify documents, and there's no one paid to declassify them, or very few. And so what you do when you say anything that's classified from now on in is going to be a criminal offense to publish, is you limit about 50% of the information your papers publish every day about foreign affairs or about national defense policy.
So,
And I was going to say, the consequences of secrecy are truly frightening, because if any agency is not held accountable to the people, inevitably they begin to do things that were not in the original concept. Now, the CIA was set up after World War II to be a super intelligence gathering agency, so you know what countries that you suspect of doing things that you think are hostile are doing. But because it was totally covered by secrecy, the covert action parts, where you decide to assassinate the head of a state, or you intervene and slip so many million of dollars to a certain political party when an election is coming up in a country where you are concerned about the outcome.
say Chile.
Chile, they just admitted giving $12 million to the Portuguese Socialist Party, channeling it through certain other agencies in Europe. So what gradually
Dominican Republic.
builds then is not intelligence gathering at all, but the covert actions become the important part. And the people then become denied knowledge of the acts. And you've got a parallel locally. Undercover agents of the police department who are operating as political, not for the isolation of, let's say, a dope ring or a syndicate operation, also have to create situations so that the line of demarcation between the guy that is supposed to be getting information for the police department and then becomes an agent provocateur who does things in line with this pattern, as has happened with the Chicago Red Squad, is an inevitable consequence of secrecy.
We know, for example, you mentioned agent provocateur, which is, of course, another attribute of a totalitarian society. We know during the '68 Democratic Convention, a number of young agent provocateurs were at work. It's the most outrageous acts that were performed. They become outright war by agent provocateurs.
That's right. Well, the worst thing, the characteristic of Tsarist Russia was that you had this incredible underworld of, on the one hand, revolutionaries because there was no freedom in the country and to have politics, and on the other hand, police informers who had infiltrated the revolutionary groups. And you couldn't tell the two apart after a while. It was a police informer who tried to assassinate a czar. It was a police informer, in fact, who did assassinate, I think, Alexander. There is some belief that Stalin was a police informer during the early revolutionary years. And this kind of netherworld of agents and revolutionary tongs and people engaged in terrorism gets created by the momentum of the state, where it really creates the organizations that it's supposedly policing. And the most recent person who shot at President Ford is a classic example of our society reaching this incredible sick point where a woman who is an FBI...
But that's hardly mentioned. It was mentioned a couple of times as far as Squeaky is concerned. But once it went, the fact is she was an FBI informer.
No, it's not Squeaky. It was the other
I'm
one.
sorry, I beg your pardon.
Mrs. Moore.
Mrs. Moore.
Sarah Moore.
And it was interesting that Mayor Daley, to further try to discourage this lawsuit in which he is a defendant and we are plaintiffs, had said we need this kind of infiltration and secret informers in order to protect the life of the president. The very same day, the headline in the papers was that Mrs. Moore was an informer both for the FBI and the Treasury Department. In fact, she was accompanied by one of the secret Treasury agents, or not a secret,
Which
but
may
official
possibly be
agents,
the reason
when she
why
bought
there
her
was less
second gun.
surveillance of her than might have been otherwise the case.
But her shooting the president, I think if you wanted to analyze what happened to her psychologically, was that the enormous strain of the double life, which almost no human being can stand, of playing one role as an informer, the other role of becoming friends of the people you're informing upon, causes people to become paranoid and to crack up. And she apparently felt the need to assert herself in some spectacular way because she had been exposed as an informer and she'd lost her standing with these people that she was informing on. And she felt the only thing she could do was to become a national something or other by taking a shot at the president.
So madness also, by the way, madness also becomes an attribute of this particular phenomenon. Madness, too.
You take Gordon Liddy, who was apparently ready to shoot Jack Anderson because he felt that Jeb Magruder wanted to get rid of him. These are the characters that are produced by these secret agencies.
Talking to Robert Borosage and Richard Crowley is more on the subject of what? The subject of us, really. Madness, paranoia, mostly being watched, being spied on. and Robert Borosage with the Center for National Security Studies, and Dick Crowley, one of the founders of the Alliance to End Repression. We'll resume this conversation in just a moment after this message. Resuming the conversation, in view of what Dick Crowley just said, Bob, this aspect of kind of nuttiness creeps in too, does it not?
Well, it does in a variety of ways. First of all, if you're going to recruit someone to be an informer, inevitably the kinds of people who will take that job are people on the fringes of society. They're betwixt and between groups. They're part criminal, part policeman. They're part revolutionary, part rightist. They don't belong to anything, and that kind of built-in schizophrenia is part of simply the recruitment. Similarly for the CIA, when you have an agency that's engaged in bribery and murder and infiltration throughout the world, and it has an image of James Bond and E. Howard Hunt, the kinds of people you recruit over time, the kinds of people who apply for the job, who look to it for excitement, are rogues, are adventurers, are people who have no sense of law or restraint. They're people who are looking for action. And
Or have a marble or two missing, too.
And then, of course, in that clandestine world, start to have a marble or two missing if they didn't.
You were talking earlier, if there were an S1, Ellsberg would have been arrested if there were an expert Pentagon. What about the journalists? What about Neil Sheehan, who put it together? And what about Robert Woodward and, say, Carl Bernstein, too, who exposed Watergate with all the King's men, and their articles in the Washington Post?
Well, at present, anyway, the law would still apply to them, and they, too, could be criminally prosecuted.
And covers it in the most detailed fashion. See, now you violate a secrecy classification by giving somebody something that is marked secret. There is no criminal penalty. The only action that can be taken is that the person who gave it to you can be fired from his government job or whatever if he deserves it. So S1, in creating this elaborate apparatus to enforce secrecy with criminal penalties, carries them out to such a point literally that everybody involved in the Pentagon Papers, including the linotype guy and the copy boy that took the copy to the linotype and the kid who was delivering the newspaper in the morning, every one of them literally would violate the law because they were passing on a secret, quote, to somebody not authorized to receive it.
Part of a conspiracy.
No, you don't even need the conspiracy theory. They violated the law because the law is that you either gave a classified document to someone not authorized to receive it, which means all but a tiny few of people have been given security clearance, or there's another penalty involved that you get this secret. You are obligated to forthwith return it to the appropriate agency in the government, which I assume would be the FBI. And if you let it sit in the bottom of your closet for a week, you are committing a penalty by not immediately returning it. Of course, if you do return it to the FBI, then you're going to sit down with the FBI agent. He's going to say, where'd you get the document? And you're in other kinds of trouble. But it would cover every single aspect of the chain of information getting out, and would at the same time essentially eliminate the important process, which remains in a somewhat unclear way, but still remains in our law, where you have an ultimate judgment as to whether or not this thing really did endanger national security. See, the crux of the Ellsberg case really was, did the publication of the Pentagon Papers endanger national security? Obviously it didn't. We're just as secure now as we were before the publication of the papers.
We're aware, though. The public is aware, though.
Right.
It would not have been otherwise.
But what the government could not avoid having to do was that they had to go to that jury to try to convince them that it was an essential secret. S1 would eliminate that part of the process and make the secrecy an automatic component of the government stamp or of the definition of what is national defense information.
It's very important for people to understand the extent to which secrecy is used to cover up illegal acts on the part of government officials. Ellsberg, of course, revealed the Pentagon Papers, and the Pentagon Papers detailed what many would consider an aggressive war. But look at the other programs, the domestic programs that have been revealed. It was revealed, for instance, 3 years ago that military intelligence for 5 years had surveilled over 200,000 Americans, including Senator Muskie, at Earth Day. Right? They had files on some 100,000 subject files with their background, their sex habits, etc. They had agents in political groups ranging from the Urban League to the Americans for Democratic Action. And the only reason the program was revealed and stopped was because some of their agents went public. They leaked the information, went public, and stopped it. The CIA's domestic program's exactly the same way. The way Cy Hirsch got the story for the New York Times was that 50 middle-level officials in the CIA were disturbed that they were being asked to do illegal things.
And Victor Marchetti, Philip Agee examples.
Right. Victor Marchetti, the covert actions abroad, exactly the same way, where a former agent goes public and says, look, this is what they're doing in your name. The same thing happened with the FBI and COINTELPRO. All these kinds of things get leaked by officials who are concerned that they're being forced to do illegal actions under the cover of secrecy. And to make that a criminal offense, and to make it a criminal offense to publish it as a reporter, or to write it as a reporter, to publish it as a newspaper, is to end the safety valve.
So Woodward and Bernstein, since there was somebody named Deep Throat who leaked stuff to Woodward, Woodward and Bernstein would also be criminally liable, would they not, under the S1 as it is now?
To the extent that their information was based on classified information, yes.
So we come to the question of classified information as to what is this particular charade that's being used a great deal has been. William Florence is a member of your group, the Center for National Security Studies. Now, who was he?
Well,
who is he and who was he?
William Florence worked for 20 years as a civilian employee in the Defense Department, and previously he served it for almost 20 years as a military official in the Air Force. In all those times, he was what was called a security classification expert. That is, his job was to review classification systems and to classify documents that needed to be classified. He retired recently, and one of the things he did when he was retired, he was asked to testify before Congress about classification. And his statement was very simple. He said 99% of the things that he's seen that are classified, 99% of the classified documents simply shouldn't be classified, are illegally or unnecessarily classified. But the bureaucracy is such that there is no incentive to declassify documents, and there's a great incentive to classify them, because all bureaucrats, of course, like secrecy.
So there's a Parkinson's law involved here, too.
That's right.
S1, though, goes beyond classification because, and the law is a little bit unclear, it also penalizes what it calls national defense information, which is given 9 definitions. These 9 definitions include what they call intelligence concerning a foreign power, which I suppose could mean anything having to do with foreign policy. It has a blanket coverage of all intelligence operations of the United States. And a document need not be classified. Information need not be classified to be national defense information, and people could be prosecuted for it. As a matter of fact, the espionage law, they've got an espionage 1 and 2, do not depend directly on whether or not the document was classified, merely that it is a document or a fact that fits into this 9-part definition of national defense information.
What is Florence? What did he finally come to? What's his conclusion then? How much of the stuff that is classifiable should be from the standpoint of national defense?
About 1%.
Really?
Right.
And then most of that would cease to be classifiable after, passage of a few months or a year.
That's all, and that's what's necessary for the defense. And Bill, with his background, is not what you would call a civil libertarian or a flaming radical. He's a very conservative man who has his country at
By
heart.
the way, have you found this to be the case? Just we speak at the moment what appears to be apathy or a sort of zombieistic feeling on the part of the public. More and more people who were involved with this are now blowing the whistle and speaking out. Do you find this to be the case?
No, there's no question of that. I mean, one of the things that make a lot of us feel fairly good at this point is that apparently living in that bureaucratic jungle and living behind that wall of secrecy does not totally remove, for many people, their feelings of being a citizen, of having a responsibility beyond their job or beyond their personal career. And now when the activities of these intelligence agencies are under review, a number of them are coming forward and saying these are the kinds of questionable orders or illegal activities that I was asked to do or I did, and I think these ought to be reviewed. And a number of them, of course, are stuck. When you're in the bureaucracy, your job depends on you carrying out your tasks, and you have a wife and a family that you are supporting. you don't easily disobey your superior or question his orders. And so a lot of them are asked to do and do things that they feel very uncomfortable with.
What happened to Fitzgerald? Remember Fitzgerald? What was that again? He was exposing the fact that some of the purchases of a certain plane, that certain plane was no good, wasn't that it? The accountant Fitzgerald.
Right, Ernie Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
Basically, it was the cost overruns on the C-5A and the extent to which the contract was simply being ignored or violated or grossly abused on the part of Lockheed and the Air Force, in collusion with the Air Force. He was an Air Force employee. He went public with it to Congress. He was then fired because the bureaucracy, of course, protects its own. He sued because under the law as it was, he was simply doing his job, and he's been reinstated, but he's now put in charge of paper by the bureaucrats, so he doesn't get in anyone's way.
You've had the case locally. Are there some locally who are going public?
Well, the interesting ones who've gone public happen to be the members of the Legion of Justice. And this is within, my knowledge is not total. I have no idea who is testifying before the state's attorney's criminal grand jury that is investigating this also for criminal acts. See, our civil suit doesn't deal with what crimes they committed in a criminal sense. We are dealing with the violations of constitutional rights which are the subject of a civil suit and which are enforceable by court order, but do not represent burglary and things of that
sort. Why
sort.
was the Attorney General Levy, why was he added as a defendant?
Now, see, this is the new suit
Yeah.
that has been initiated by the ACLU, which was also party to the original suit, and now they're kind of enlarging it. The reason is that there is a network extending from top to bottom. The lowest level are the police department intelligence units or red squads or whatever you want to call them. And they probably represent the largest manpower commitment to the whole spying apparatus of any. And then it works its way up all the way to the top where you've got FBI, you had military intelligence, you had CIA. And there is an interlinking from what we know about the red squad. We know that there was links with military intelligence and also with the FBI and we believe with CIA. And so it's on the basis of these links that we know of or strongly suspect that the suit has added the Attorney General of the United States. Very logic.
So that, now we come to something, don't we? The matter of a web here. There's a web aspect to it, is there not? The fact that it can be the secret government you speak of nationally, might we say multinationally, can come to the neighborhood, can it not?
Well, there's no question that one of the things that has occurred over the last 5 years is a real attempt to link up all of the police organizations, all of the intelligence organizations. For example, the Rockefeller Report revealed that the CIA had a list of 300,000 people who had been arrested for crimes associated with homosexuality. Now, why they had the list is another question, but just leaving that aside, the only way you could get a list of 300,000 people with arrest records on anything is to have contacts not just with the FBI, but with a nationalized, computerized information center that's then passing its information from the CIA to the IRS to the FBI. And that kind of thing, in the Rockefeller Report, you see it over and over again. In the mail opening program, where the CIA was running for 22 years an illegal program to intercept the mail of American citizens, the FBI gave them a watch list of 100 people, and they wanted their mail open for their own reasons. The CIA gave a list of 1,000 organizations to the National Security Agency, so they'd intercept their international telephone calls, and on it goes. And you see these kinds of links getting put into place more and more.
So, since the time of the Gestapo or the KGB, or since the time of whatever other secret police there were in other societies, something new has happened, something's been added, and that is technology.
Right.
Right, the saving grace of the Tsarist police force was that they were terribly inefficient. And of course technology adds to your ears, adds to your eyes, and increases your efficiency to some extent. The other thing is that there was always a theory in America, which was that we would operate one way abroad and another way at home. That is, you'd have the CIA running amok overseas and doing whatever it had to do to defend democracy or whatever. But we would have a government that followed the laws and was respected the liberties of its citizens at home. And that would be a contrast, for instance, to the KGB, which is both the internal and the external police of the Soviet Union. And it turns out that it's just not possible. What happens is that when you have an agency that's lawless abroad, is inevitably those things come home. By imitation, the attitudes come home, the structures come home, the agency itself comes home, its agents come home, and the structures get recapitulated domestically.
I remember a comment Ellsberg made during one of the television press programs, the very fact that there is the enemy abroad. Somebody chooses that as the enemy. And once you have that aspect, everybody who is not you is the enemy. It was inevitable that the committee to re-elect the president would say, well, the enemy is here, someone not us. And thus it became the Democratic Party, the enemy. So the idea you cannot separate a foreign policy from a domestic policy is what you're saying.
And you can't separate the concept that it's okay for us to totally violate the law abroad and expect these same people to feel that they're not going to violate the law at home.
In the Senate hearings, James Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, testified. He is the man who, for 22 years, I think 20 years, ran the CIA's mail intercept program, which intercepted and opened mail sent by Americans to foreign countries. Angleton was asked whether he had problems with it since it directly violated 2 statutes, literally on their face. He said that he found it, quote, inconceivable that a secret intelligence arm of the government has to comply with the overt orders of that government. Inconceivable that it had to obey the law. And of course that was on a thing that was concerning Americans. It was at home and not abroad.
Funny. William Colby seems sort of respectable now, as he's questioned very reverently, with a great deal of respect. Yet he was behind the Phoenix program, was he not?
In Vietnam. He was the director of it.
Vietnam, yeah. Which was involving mass murder, really.
Well, assassinations or murders of at least 20,000 people by their own figures.
But this is another aspect, don't you? The secret police, the intelligence people, again, euphemisms. Generally, I find most of them, look at them, rimless glasses, very prissy looking, not at all Wallace Beery, not at all the stereotype villain, heavy jowled, club in hand. On the contrary, quite gentle speaking, but with a great deal of righteousness, of course. The aspect of course is part of it.
Well, of course, the other thing is we have what is commonly referred to as bureaucratic murder now, so that a William Colby, while he writes out the orders, doesn't pull the trigger. And the people who are murderers are people we never see. They're people on contract.
Not accidentally, mafia guys are involved, isn't that
including
so?
the mafia.
So I suppose if a gangster technique is called upon, you call upon
The
that is
experts.
official gangsters.
That's right.
Although I have 2 acquaintances, both were, you might describe them as quasi-legitimate. I call one Kid Farrow, and the other one Doc Graham, and one has served time. Both they've been burglars, and they're furious at the Watergate 7 because of the lack of craftsmanship involved. And they describe how they'd have done it, and of course they're furious at Dean, because he told upon the boss. You don't do that, you see. And they are a couple of gangsters describing a gangster operation, but it was not done well. Because the horror, it's very funny, it's Brecht, of course. At the same time, suppose those guys were good burglars. Where we have been today? An interesting question, isn't it?
Well, I'm thankful they weren't.
Yeah. I suppose, many questions, but right now the Committee under Frank Church is investigating CIA intelligences. Your thoughts? Is it the job being done?
Well, the Church Committee got waylaid because the president forced them to look at assassinations. And while assassinations are shocking and it's deplorable that the agency was ever involved in such things, and of course they were contracted the mafia to do some of them against Fidel Castro. The major activities of the CIA are not assassinations. The major activities is a structure of agents, of bribes, and of political control that goes through the third world. And that structure, I don't think the Church Committee is going to do much about. I think it's going to have a hard time investigating it because it doesn't have time, and I think it's not going to reveal much to us in those terms. What it has revealed, and it's been effective at it, is the kind of pattern of lawlessness that goes through the agency. It revealed, for instance, the CIA official who violated the president's order to destroy the poisons. It will reveal the kinds of assassination attempts in its report that went on. In terms of its recommendations, that's what I think we have the most to fear about. I think what the Church Committee is going to do is recommend a joint oversight committee. And now joint oversight committees are like a congressional placebo. It makes everybody think something's happening and nothing does happen. And everybody feels a little better, but in fact what happens is worse than where we were before. I think what's happening in Washington is there's a struggle for who's going to control the Congress. On the one hand, there's the executive agencies and the intelligence agencies that are saying, look, we'll give you the secrets. We'll give you a seat backstage as long as you applaud at the right time. Don't make trouble, and don't leak it to the rest of the audience. And the rest of the audience, of course, is the American people. And on the other hand, there is the American people who are saying to their congressmen, look, you're supposed to represent us. You're supposed to keep these people from doing illegal activities. You're supposed to keep them from coming home and surveilling us. And we want them investigated. And that struggle is a very close one in Washington. And unless the American people get more mobilized and put more pressure on their congressmen and their senators, I think they may well get co-opted into the national security structure, get co-opted by being given a seat backstage. And the example is the thing that Richard mentioned earlier. The CIA, for the last 3 months, the president and Colby have been going around saying, we can't do anything abroad because of this investigation, and it's destroying us. But it turns out that they went to the congressional oversight committees and said to them, we're going to intervene in Portugal. We're going to give millions of dollars to the Portuguese Socialist Party under the table. And there was substantial opposition in the congressional committees to that program. But they were bound by secrecy oaths not to go public with it. None of them did, and the money flowed in spite of their opposition. So they got a seat backstage. They got to know what was going on behind the cover story that was given to the rest of us. But in terms of our interest, or our opinions, or even their own independent opinions, it had no effect. And that's really the danger of what's happening in Washington.
You know, I think, Studs, we get down to a very important question. You talk about apathy, and I don't think people are that apathetic. The thing is, they're frustrated because you don't know what I can do. Well, I think we learn an important political lesson in the struggle for impeachment and around Watergate, and that is that where the public are aroused enough, Congress can reflect what people think. If our voices are loud enough, congressmen are elected every 2 years. They know that to hold on, they have to be answerable to a public to a degree. And I think both the faults and the virtues of Congress come from the political input. Sometimes the input, from the John Birch Society or the Ku Klux Klan or the National Rifle Association isn't the best in the public interest. But they do respond. And I saw something happen in the House Committee that to me was really frightening. One congressman, Harrington from Massachusetts, who I think was really trying to do a job, went public, told about the facts that had come before that committee of how the United States government had intervened to overthrow the Allende government in Chile. Well, this had happened. It was past history already, so that even the question of the currency as applies to the Portuguese situation was not a factor there. And yet the majority of that committee censured Harrington for violating his supposed obligation of secrecy to other members of Congress and for having placed his loyalty to the American people on the highest level. And I think that in relation to these investigations, as well as to Senate 1, we are somehow going to have to channel people's thinking into getting on the backs of their congressmen and senators.
Coming back to Congress on that matter of Harrington, whereas Lucien Nedzi hid it from the people. He conspired, and he was honored by Congress, whereas Harrington was pilloried.
He was given a vote of confidence after it was revealed that he had known about the assassinations and not said anything, known about the domestic stuff and not said anything.
But the one who went public with the non-classified information, that fait accompli, horrendously so, he was pilloried by Congress for being a public servant.
Well, the information was still classified, but it shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
But I think we've got to be careful that we don't get cynical and say, those guys in Congress are so bad, no point in talking to them. In a way, unfortunately, they're kind of a litmus paper, reflecting what they can interpret as the thinking of the people from their districts. And I think we waste a great deal of time commenting on the obvious sometimes as to the inadequacy of the performance of representatives in Congress, instead of looking at ourselves, looking at our community, looking at the neighborhood, and judging whether or not we are effectively sending the signals to that person.
Okay, then you raise the question as we near the end of the hour. Robert Borosage and Dick Crowley, what to do? Your groups, what they're doing, what are your suggestions? Bob.
The center itself is a tax-exempt institution, so we don't do lobbying. We simply do educational stuff. As an individual and a citizen, I recommend two things. I think the clear reform program has to be that we have to pass laws that make bureaucrats personally responsible for their criminal activities and set up a special prosecutor to prosecute them when they do criminal acts. And the obvious response is what I think people ought to do in different areas is get together with their colleagues, get together with their friends, get together with their associates, try to get together 100 or so people and call their congressman back or their congressional representative back to meet with them and to talk about this whole range of issues and then tell them face to face what to do. Now, if you can't do that, if that's too hard, then and you want to operate alone, then I think at least a letter helps. But I think it's time to assert to the congressmen in kind of physical ways that they come from the district, they're responsible to those people, and they have to come back and talk to them about issues, and not talk to them about pablum or apple pie.
Yeah, and I think obviously we're getting down to the crunch with Senate 1 in connection with the Senate action. The bill is now before the full Judiciary Committee. It very probably will be passed in some form by Judiciary and be reaching the Senate floor sometime early next year. And because it is so complex, it's almost 800 pages, it is most important, first of all, that our own two senators be made aware of the fact that there is tremendous interest in this bill. I think what we have to insist be done is that that bill, which is so totally and skillfully flawed, it really requires something like 3,000 changes if we were to use that bill, the kind of amending that cannot be done at this stage. We must insist that it be sent back to the subcommittee for a total overhaul and redraft. How can we do this effectively with these senators? Well, individually we can all speak out, we can write letters, we can make phone calls. This is very important. But there are a number of organizations in the Chicago area that are deeply involved. There is my own Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights, which is part of the National Committee Against Repressive Legislation that has really done the pioneer job in exposing Senate 1. American Civil Liberties Union is really working very hard and very effectively. The Alliance to End Repression, which is a coalition of over 50 organizations, is deeply involved in this. Many things are being done, and if someone wants to do more than just write the letter, I would urge that they take a look at the telephone book, look up one of these organizations, make a phone call, and say, I'd like to do something more. What's happening?
That was the Chicago Civil Liberties Committee, the Alliance to End Repression, and the Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And they're all three in the book. By the way,
American Civil Liberties Union.
American Civil Liberties Union. By the way, Robert Borosage, the Center for National Security Studies, they send stuff out, you know.
Sure. We will send information about, we have pamphlets on the CIA, on secrecy, on how to use the Freedom of Information Act. We have a new booklet that's just coming out that summarizes the domestic abuses of all the intelligence agencies.
Let's have your address.
It's 122 Maryland Avenue, Northeast.
122 Maryland Avenue, Northeast.
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C.
20002.
122 Maryland Avenue, Northeast, Washington, D.C. 20002.
And they have issued some of the most...
It's called Center for National Security Studies.
And their material is beautiful.
So it's good reading, too.
It is.
Okay, Robert Borosage and Richard Crowley, thank you very much. The word is qui vive. Let me turn this off. That was a good hour. I think we got everything in, didn't we?
I think we covered the waterfront pretty well.
I don't know whether it's going to track, but...